In the fall of 2007, there were many first-person shooters being released. We saw the beginning of a brand new IP with BioShock. The gameplay was a mix of shooting action along with powers, and other options along with providing a compelling narrative. Also, that fall provided us with the conclusion to the original Halo trilogy. At this time, Halo was the first-person shooter everyone wanted to beat, and 3 delivered on its promises and provided a satisfying conclusion. The 4th entry of the growing Call of Duty franchise was attempting to change the game from a shift from World War II to a modern combat setting. And these were just some of the big FPS games during the fall, and there were other games in other genres releasing as well, like Uncharted and Mass Effect 1. This was a very crowded time and one that was full of big new games along with continuations. But during this time, there was another first-person shooter that got overlooked by all of these other releases. Timeshift was and is a quality title that provided solid action mixed with its time manipulation mechanics, while also having an interesting development cycle. Join me as we take a look back at Timeshift. In 2001, Saber Interactive was founded, and their first title they worked on was known as Will Rock. This was a first-person shooter on the PC and received both very high and very low reviews. While Saber's first game did not break any new ground, it showed that they could develop a fun game that later went on to be an underrated classic for many. Following this project, the studio again wanted to explore the first-person shooter genre, and with World War II shooters taking up a lot of popularity at the time, they wanted to move away from that. This young studio wanted to help distinguish itself from other releases, and while great visuals, a unique story, and art style could help with this, these developers felt that introducing interesting gameplay mechanics would greatly help them achieve their goal. The CEO of the company had an idea for a mechanic to be used in a first-person shooter that came to him during his time at college. He and his roommate loved the instant replay feature in the Madden football games. They both would use the slowdown, pause, and rewind plays feature. While this wasn't exactly a time control feature, this is where the idea was born to take these time manipulation elements and potentially infuse them into a first-person shooter, and thus Timeshift was born. Timeshift would allow for the player to use 3 powers: slow motion, time stop, and rewind. This would allow for a lot of options both from the shootouts and with interacting with the environment. For example, the player may need to cross a bridge, but it is destroyed, so the player can rewind time before it was destroyed and then cross it. These powers would allow for the opportunity to be creative, like bullet dodging along with some interesting traversal like walking on water as time is stopped. From the very beginning, the developers did not want the time mechanics to be a gimmick, but rather something that is fully integrated into the gameplay. To provide a balance between the power fantasy and a satisfying challenge, the studio took a simple approach with the powers. They wanted to get away from any type of item or resource management as a means to use the powers. Instead, all 3 of these time abilities would be tied to one energy bar, and this would slowly regenerate over time. This was a simple system that prevented overuse and always meant that these powers were available to the player at all times. Each of the powers would use up more or less energy, meaning that the player would need to carefully plan their ability usage. The first-person shooter would be the genre, and the time manipulation would be the hook. And to make all of this a reality, Saber decided to make their own in-house engine for Timeshift.
Identification accepted.
Timeshift's single player was designed with a linear campaign in mind, but it would offer some instances of non-linearity. Early on, levels would be built with multiple options in mind, so the path might be more narrow, but the options in how you tackle them would allow for a few different ways to do it, based on the weapons that the player used and how they use their time powers. Along with this, the developers wanted to have the player revisit the same levels again, but at a different point in time. This way the player could feel like they are playing something a bit familiar that gets completely turned on its head. There would be a mixture of normal and power-infused enemies. As an example, there would be guards that could try to catch the player off balance with their superhuman speed, and the player could use their time powers to keep the playing field level. The story would focus on Michael Swift, a recently retired colonel in the Air Force, who has been recruited by the US government to test 2 new time-controlled devices. At the start of the story, Swift would make a short journey to the past, and when he returns, the world is very different than how it initially was. He has now become an enemy of the state and must find a way to restore history. The writers wanted Swift to be a reluctant hero who is determined to correct the timeline. The narrative would explore some interesting concept, like having one version of yourself replace another, experiencing the same area at 2 different points in time. For example, Swift would fight through an altered present in Washington, D.C., and then see a completely different version of it in the year 1911. Eventually, Swift would be working to rebuild a time machine to even stop a past version of himself. To help sell the cinematic angle of the narrative, the developers recruited both Hollywood and industry talent, with Dennis Quaid voicing Swift and Michael Ironside, best known as Sam Fisher in the Splinter Cell series, would be the main antagonist.
The interesting thing about doing these games and stuff like that is that there's so many people involved. There's the writing, there's the animation, and finding a middle ground where we all feel comfortable.
Where is he?
I find it fun, and it's like walking a tightrope at the beginning of this session. Am I going to fall on my face and piss everyone off, or are we going to find a nice happy medium?
What the? Who are... Thanks for sitting in for me. I love it when a plan comes together.
Late in development, the studio was ready to release a demo to gain even more awareness on their title, along with receiving feedback. While many were excited to try this new game out and enjoyed the time manipulation mechanics, the demo overall received a lot of negative attention. Some cited problems with the narrative, along with the demo being rather buggy. This eventually caused the publisher, Atari, to drop the project altogether, resulting in Vivendi picking up the game. The new publisher went to Saber and asked them what the team could do if they were given an additional year to work on it. Saber took this year to change and potentially improve many areas of their game. Much of the gameplay loop and mechanics remain the same, but many of the elements surrounding it were reworked. For example, the old art style was more steampunk, and this was changed to be a more visceral and gritty art style. The original Xbox version of the game was cancelled, and the focus would be for the PC and the next-gen console releases at the time. Originally, the game had 34 levels, with the first 3 being focused on establishing the story and providing tutorials for the player. These were completely removed and rebuilt from the ground up. As a result of this year, the final count of the single-player levels went from 34 to 24, in an effort to improve the pacing. The shooting and gameplay elements were not changed, but only tweaked and tested to better the experience. The team even received feedback from some of the developers of Fear for this area. Another area that saw a big change was the story. The original narrative revolving around Michael Swift was completely taken out, along with all of the original cutscenes. This meant not using any of the prior talent like Dennis Quaid and Michael Ironside in the narrative. Now the player would be an unnamed scientist who would acquire the time travel suit to stop the evil scientist Crone. Based on feedback from focus groups, the original main character and narrative were hard to connect to, which resulted in the use of the unnamed protagonist as a means to show that the player is the hero of the story. Now the game's story would primarily be focused on venturing into a war-torn world that was caused by Crone's mad scientist actions. Saber had to make a bunch of tough decisions on finding the best avenue for their game. The original vision for the gameplay was retained, but most of the elements surrounding it were changed in an attempt to make the experience better. Saber wanted to create a first-person shooter that separated itself from its competitors, and while we will never really know what the original story could have been, what is true is that these developers were able to make the best out of a less than ideal development situation. In October 2007, Timeshift was released to the world. Timeshift is a sci-fi first-person shooter with time manipulation elements. The shooting action is very solid. The game is mostly focused on the gunfights with some mild puzzle elements. The concepts for the puzzles are pretty neat, but they lack any engaging problem solving to complete them. Most of the time the answers are just provided to you, but the gunfights are always thoroughly engaging. There's a nice arsenal of weapons here and a good soundtrack that heightens the action. While the story starts off well from a presentation standpoint, the actual narrative and storytelling is very weak. The game does a poor job of introducing you into its world and mostly feels like a misfire when it comes to the storytelling. While this area of the game could have been better, thankfully it never gets in the way of the action, and that is where the focus of Timeshift is. In Timeshift, you will be spending most of your time in gunfights. The shooting is satisfying from both the sound effects to the impact. The gun sounds like they have some power behind them, and this is furthered through the impact of your shots. Enemies often die with a generous amount of ragdoll and satisfying blood effects that even have blood appearing on the walls near the shot enemies. On top of this is the amount of dismemberment with some of your weapons. Some weapons can cause enemies' heads, arms, and legs to fly off, adding to the intensity of the gunfights with the environmental destruction. Bullets hitting walls have a tendency to kick up a lot of dirt and chunks of the wall. In some cases, entire pieces of cover can be destroyed. Your arsenal is a mix of expected and cool weapons, especially with how each weapon has a secondary fire. The assault rifle has an undermounted grenade launcher, whereas the SMG has a flamethrower attached to it. There are some unique ranged weapons like an explosive crossbow that is good for sniping. You can carry 3 weapons at a time, and this is where some of the personalization comes into play, with what playstyle you want to adopt. The personalization is not vast, but there's enough here if you want to specialize in long or short range combat more. The enemies come in a few different forms like soldiers, rushers, jump jet infantry, vehicles, and some with powers. The enemy variety is decent and allows for the gunfights to change enough throughout the campaign. Outside of your weapons, you will have your time powers. You have an energy bar that regenerates over time, and you can opt to use this energy for one of your 3 different powers. You can slow down time, stop time, and rewind time. The slow-mo acts as a means to provide you with enhanced mobility and precision for the gunfights. You can use this to get in close to another enemy, move a bit faster, or escape to another position. The stop time completely stops all of the enemies and their projectiles. While it takes up more energy, stopping time also allows you to regenerate your health quicker and easily kill a few enemies. One of my favorite features with the stop time is how you can steal the weapon right out of an enemy's hand. Once time goes back to normal, they will act confused and then surrender to you. This adds a bit of humor into the game and very much feels like something that someone would do if they were in this situation. While the slow-mo shooting is great, the stop time kills are my personal favorites, as you set up a bunch of shots for a few enemies and then watch them all fly back once normal time resumes. For the combat encounters, the powers have a specific use, and outside of other enhancements like stopping time providing you with a quick health refill, there is not a lot of experimentation for developing vastly different strategies with these powers. There is some in a limited capacity, but Timeshift's execution is more straightforward than you might first expect. This would be an issue if the action wasn't engaging, but the shootouts are great from the very first to the very last one. The powers are also used in short puzzle segments. This is also mainly where you will use your rewind ability. In most cases, you need to use your powers to get through an obstacle to get to the next shootout. For example, you may need to stop time so that you can walk on water. The use of the powers are pretty cool, but the puzzles do not really require much in the way of problem solving, so they are good from a presentation standpoint but feel a bit lackluster when playing them. We will get into more of that later. The campaign has a decent amount of varied locations that you will be fighting through, like a destroyed city, subways, prisons, and a few more. In many cases, you will fight ground vehicles, and you can use those mounted turrets to take out the enemy soldiers. There are a few driving sequences that are pretty fun as well. The action is at the forefront of the game and where Timeshift is at its best. Timeshift's story starts off interesting enough, but what follows is a narrative that is poorly told and conveyed to the player. The game launches you right into the action without much context, but since there isn't much explained to you, there is a lack of stakes and proper world building to really get you invested in what is going on. You get a short glimpse between levels, but I was more confused than captivated by it. You spend most of the time stopping this other time traveler and being part of a resistance in an uprising, but the game does not have any form of development or much characterization for any of its its characters. If the game had a few characters that you could understand their motivations or even connect with, it would have made the poorly told narrative more enjoyable to experience. The story feels like a missed opportunity and greatly could have benefited from a more experienced writer. The trade-off is that the story and cutscenes are so minimal that they never interfere with the good gameplay. When it comes to the other flaws, I have a few. The sound mixing at several parts, especially in the first few levels, can be pretty poor. So much so that it can be hard to hear what people are saying. My next comment is going to seem a bit odd, but I found the dismemberment to be a bit inconsistent. So explosives and mounted turrets will cause dismemberment, but a shotgun point blank to the head does not cause it to pop off. I wish the assault rifle, SMG, and shotgun caused the enjoyable dismemberment found with the explosives. There are a few gotcha moments that feel like they were just made to cause intentional death to the player because they didn't know what was coming. In line with this, there are two awful helicopter fights. These light boss fights are drawn out and are not fun to engage with. My main issues come from the time powers in the puzzle areas. The game has a tendency to just give you the answer for the puzzles and let you know which power to use to overcome it. And in situations where the game doesn't explicitly tell you what to do, it will auto-select the correct time power you need to use to complete the puzzle. The powers here are rather unique, and I feel like the game barely scratched the surface when using them with the puzzles. Granted, the puzzles are short, so the pacing is never hurt, but I feel like there could have been a lot more done here. Timeshift does have some annoying flaws, but the action is very good and it's consistent from the very beginning to the very end. I had a really good time with this one. Timeshift is an overlooked first-person shooter. It has a solid gameplay loop of engaging shootouts, fun guns, and interesting powers. While the arsenal is not vast, the weapons that are here are pretty awesome, especially the explosive crossbow and the SMG that doubles as a flamethrower. The action is consistently good, and thankfully most of the game centers around the shooting. The light puzzle-solving elements are good from a presentation standpoint, but they are not involved enough from the problem-solving angle. The story is easily one of the weakest aspects about the game, and thankfully it does not get in the way of the action. While the developers did receive negative feedback on the initial narrative, I honestly would have loved to see the original story. Based on what I was able to see through old videos, it was already more interesting and better set up than the narrative that was in the final build. Plus, the idea of having Sam Fisher be the main bad guy would have been awesome to just hear him, even if the writing ended up being bad. Timeshift unfortunately suffered a bit from a troubled development, and eventually released in a crowded market. This is an easy recommendation if you are looking for a solid first-person shooter that holds up very well. If you are interested in being notified of new videos, please hit the subscribe button and bell. And if you would like to support the channel and get early access to content, please check out my Patreon. All of the links will be at the end of this video and within the description. And thank you very much for watching.